Hello, welcome to Basic Bits and Pieces Biology Lesson 1. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about what science is, what biology is, and what the properties of life are. So let's go ahead and get started. Science. Science is a pursuit of knowledge. It comes from the Latin root word scientia, which means knowledge, and it's based in a series of observations or measurements, also known as quantification. So we are able to look at the physical world and take measurements or take observations and see if there is a pattern involved to make predictions. And so science argues that physical properties and living things follow predictable patterns, and from these measurements, these observations, we're able to draw general laws or conclusions. And so an example of this would be the law of gravity. We know that gravity affects us in kind of a pushing down motion, and that anything that goes up must come down. And this is based on observations. So biology, what is biology? It comes from the two parts of the word bio, meaning life, and ology, meaning study of. So it's the study of life. You may see bio attached to other things like biodiversity, which is the diversity of life. And you may see ology attached to other things such as pathology, which means the study of pathogens or things that make us sick. So biology is the study of living organisms, their interactions, and their environments. So biology does look at how the environment, including non-living things, affect living things. So we will branch out of only living things a little bit, but for the most part, we're looking at living organisms and their properties. So what is the difference between a living and non-living thing? Well, even children kind of have an idea that a rock is not living and a bird is. A box is not living and a tree is. A flower is alive, but the air is not. So we do know that there's a difference between living things and non-living things, and biologists have a list of properties which allow us to determine, is this living, is this not? But examples of non-living things include water, air, and rocks. So elements of the environment may not be living, however, they may affect living things. So what do biologists study? They study living things such as humans, animals, plants, small creatures, very small microorganisms, things that you cannot see with your naked eye, that you have to use a microscope for, including bacteria, and then even submicroscopic agents such as viruses. Now, viruses themselves are not living things, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. There are domains of biology that biologists study, and biologists can specialize in any of these things. And there are properties of life which are universal to living things, and these include order, environmental sensitivity and response to the environment, reproduction and heredity, growth, development, regulation, homeostasis, energy processing and use, and then evolution and adaptation. So order, all living organisms consist of one or more cells, and they have a physical structure to them. They are ordered in the sense that there's not just random elements to them, there's something organized about them. They are sensitive, which means that they respond to stimuli. So if it's too hot, they could become dehydrated, or if it's too cold, they could have, they can be stunted, or they could even die. So they are sensitive to the environment. And then they have reproduction and heredity. They have genetics. And their children may be like them based on their genetics. And they're able to have babies, or they're able to reproduce through self-cloning. But it's just not one organism. They're able to have multiple organisms. They're able to create more. And then growth and development, they're able to go from being very small to larger creatures, if that is the kind of organism they are. So a human goes from being a single cell to being multiple cells to being a full-grown adult. A butterfly will go through its changes. So they're able to develop. And then regulation and homeostasis means that the temperature is regulated, the chemicals within the organism are regulated, and then homeostasis is they maintain constant internal conditions that are different than the surrounding environment. So they don't become one with the environment, they are unique. Energy processing and use, they can take either food, calories, or they can take sunlight, some form of energy, and process it so that they're able to grow, that they're able to live, they're able to breathe, they're able to move, depending on what the organism is. And then we have evolutionary adaptation, which is the interactions of the organism with the environment and other organisms, and how these survive. So evolution adaptation includes things like symbiosis, when multiple organisms come together and live together for a common goal of living. They're able to help each other. And then, of course, you have more parasitical situations where an organism will come and live in a creature and can actually harm the creature. That would be a sign of bad evolution. Commensalism is where one of the organisms benefits but the other doesn't, but it doesn't harm the host, and so that would be good evolutionary adaptation. So there's different kinds of considerations when we're talking about the properties of life. So evolution and phylogeny. Phylogeny is the study of the domains or the families in which we can classify living things. So we've gotten pretty complex with how we're able to classify a living thing. There's three main domains. Those are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are both microscopic organisms. And so when we're talking about those, we're going to be talking about microbiology. But eukarya can be microscopic, but eukarya is pretty much everything else. So it's everything that you can also see that's larger. So a human would follow under the eukarya domain. And we'll talk about the difference between these things later on inside our lessons, maybe in a few weeks. So we have the domains, and then we have the kingdoms. And our kingdoms are animals, plants, fungi, protists, eubacteria, and arbacteria. And so eubacteria are bacteria domain, and the archaebacteria is the archaea domain. And then we can break things down even further into a kingdom, a phylum, a class, a order, a family, a genus, and a species. And so we know that frogs are amphibians. We know that cats are felines. And so these different families, these different organisms that are alike, we can use phylogeny to see just how like they are. So there is one thing that microbiologists will study that is not living, but it's also not living, if that makes sense. So submicroscopic infectious agents such as viruses and viroids are pieces of RNA or DNA and protein. They have elements of living things in them. Living things have protein. Living things have RNA or DNA or both. But unlike living things, viruses cannot grow or reproduce outside a living cell. They need a host. The word virus comes from the word poison or toxin, and viruses were first discovered. We first had the technology to see them in 1899. So they're fairly new in the sense of us studying them. However, we've been suffering the consequences of viruses for years and years. So viruses are something that are very complex, and yet they're very simple. They're simple because they're only RNA or DNA and protein, but they're complex because we can't see them, and they are able to mutate pretty quickly because they insert themselves into a cell. The cell reproduces, and they pick up some of the RNA or DNA from that cell, and so they're able to mutate pretty quickly. But, well, viruses are a part of microbiology that is not exactly living, but it definitely affects living things. So that is all we have for today's lesson. Thank you for listening to today's lesson, and I hope you have a great day.